Speaking of being angry, someone gave me this morning, suggested we do darts, but I want to suggest he is a friend of the congregation, and in this pothole mess, he needs your prayer. He needs your prayer. So, you know, my husband is the mayor's pastor, so I'm actually kind of sincere. People are very angry with him about pothole, so please keep him in prayer. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how you imagine Jesus, or what images come to mind. Matt was great in helping me find some images this week that really are probably some of the traditional images we have when we think of Jesus. The first is this one. Remember Warner Salmon, whose grandmother did not have that picture of Jesus in your house? That's really the one that comes to mind for me. In later life, the other one is by a guy named Willis Wheatley, and I've always known that as Laughing Jesus, and it's always hung in my office or in my house. But do you know what? When he originally made that, he said that is the face of Jesus the Liberator. How about this Jesus? Do you remember this from a few years ago? In Spain, there was this famous picture of Jesus in a cathedral, in a church in Spain. It was there, it was a Martinez piece, and it was there for well over 100 years. Well, Cecilia Jimenez was in her 80s, and she was a little upset because Jesus was not looking very good. So she decided to take it upon herself, do you remember this? To go ahead and try to fix this 100-year-old fresco. And instead she came up with Monkey Jesus, as he was referred to. But you know what's interesting to me? Her restored image and her action actually made a world of difference. Do you know that this church was in great disrepair, that no one had been there for years and years, and after this hit the international news, they had over 40,000 visitors that first year. I think it was in 2012 or something. Over 40,000 visitors. They received many different donations. They were able to refurbish the church, but not only that, but people wanted to help Cecilia out as well. And so people found out what her passion was. And she really did have passion for people who had muscular dystrophy because her son struggled with it. And so since she created Monkey Jesus, she has raised thousands and thousands, well over $50,000 for muscular dystrophy. So I want to note that perhaps when we see something like that, we have to be mindful that her action moved to something far greater than a Monkey Jesus. It moved people to make a difference, and I think that her action led to goodness, which is important today. How about this Jesus? I think this would be a great Jesus for the garden. Do you remember this? Do you remember Buddy Jesus from the movie Dogma? George Carlin played Cardinal Blick, and Cardinal Blick decided that Christ crucified was just far too depressing. So he introduced Buddy Jesus. I always love that one. Well, recent archaeological digs have actually created a rendering based on men who lived during the time period of Jesus, the skeletal remains, and this is actually what they've come up with. This is most likely what Jesus looked like. Our text today is coming to us from the Gospel of John. It's part of the lectionary series that comes up during Lent, and it's often referred to as Jesus' temple tantrum. So I have to be honest, when I read this text, none of those images come to mind. Let's go ahead and take a look at the text. When the Passover feast celebrated each spring by the Jews was about to take place, Jesus traveled up to Jerusalem. He found the temple teeming with people selling cattle and sheep and doves. The loan sharks were also there in full strength. Jesus put together a whip out of strips of leather and chased them out of the temple, stampeding the sheep and the cattle, upending the tables of the loan sharks, spilling coins left and right. He told the dove merchants, "Get your things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a shopping mall." That's when the disciples remembered the scripture, "Zeal for your house consumes me." But the Jews were upset. They asked, "What credentials can you present to justify this?" Jesus answered, "Tear down this temple, and in 3 days I'll put it back together." They were indignant. Now the Jews, I think he's meaning the religious leaders as well. It took 46 years to build the temple, and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days? But Jesus was talking about his body as the temple. Later, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he had said this. Then they then put 2 and 2 together and believed both what was written in Scripture and what Jesus had said. When I read this particular text, I think this is a much more fitting image of Jesus.
I don't have to tell you things are bad. Everybody knows things are bad. It's a depression. Everybody's out of work or scared of losing their job. The dollar buys a nickel's worth. Banks are going bust. Shopkeepers keep a gun under the counter. Punks are running wild in the street, and there's nobody anywhere who seems to know what to do, and there's no end to it. We know the air is unfit to breathe, and our food is unfit to eat. We sit watching our TVs while some local newscaster tells us that today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be. We know things are bad, worse than bad. They're crazy. It's like everything everywhere is going crazy, so we don't go out anymore. We sit in the house, and slowly the world we're living in is getting smaller, and all we say is, please, at least leave us alone in our living rooms. Let me have my toaster and my TV and my steel-belted radios, and I won't say anything. Just leave us alone. Well, I'm not going to leave you alone. I want you to get mad. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to riot. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the Russians and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad. You've got to say, I'm a human being. My life has value. So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!
Now that movie is about 30 years old. Isn't that amazing? Doesn't it feel like it could be last night or yesterday? Well, for me, I think it is a good image of Jesus, and I talked to the kids already. I'm not sure Jesus would be mad as hell, but boy, that's a statement that certainly makes you realize that guy is serious about what he's talking about. Today we're going to talk a little bit about 3 different things that really made Jesus angry. 3 different things that made Jesus angry. If you look throughout the Bible, you will find that Jesus does get angry. But it's not anger that just sits there. It's always anger that's moved to action. Now, the first area where Jesus gets mad as heck and isn't going to take it anymore is when he recognizes that people, or that fig trees can grow and look beautiful and not produce fruit. That was not okay for Jesus. This is from the Gospel of Luke, the 13th chapter. He says, a man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found there was none. So he said to the gardener, see here, for 3 years I come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting good soil? Jesus was not about looking good. He was about doing good and living a life of meaning. I believe this parable is for all of us. We're not only called to grow where we are planted, but we are called to bear fruit. Our life should bear fruit. Later in Timothy, Jesus not only encourages us to be fruitful and multiply, but always be ready to be fruitful. See, as a child of God, you are always in season to be fruitful. You are always in season. Later, Leonard Sweet suggests that Jesus confronts our culture of consumption. That's what he's doing in these 2 passages. That is reflected in us being fruitless and unproductive, just like that fig tree. We look good, but we're not making anything. He says what we need to do is start working on a culture of conception, not consumption. Jesus calls his disciples and all of us to be more faithful. He calls us to be more fruitful. He wants to see and to taste and to experience the fruits of our labor, the fruits of our love. It is in living a fruitful life that we will experience and encounter God and the life that God has called us to. A life that not only consumes, no, but conceives. Not only conceives, but births new loving ideas and ways of being that will benefit not just some of us, but the whole. I think the challenge for us is to not only look good, but to ensure that we are living lives that are productive. When we live in the richest nation in the world, we are called to produce a lot of good fruit. Not only to feed those of us in this nation, but to ensure that all in the world are fed. Another thing that makes Jesus really, really angry in the Bible, and I would put this in the top 2, was how we allow our children to be damaged. Now look at Jesus. Never had a wife, never had a child of his own, but he was the biggest advocate and protector of children. One of the stories that appears in the gospel says, if you harm a child, you would be better off thrown into the sea with a millstone around your neck. I wonder if Larry Nassar has ever read that passage. There's another scene when the children are trying to get to Jesus, to encounter Jesus, and the disciples are trying to keep them away. Because they're children, they don't have value. Their greatest value is to work in your field. And Jesus shames his disciples and gets angry. And he says, let the children come to me, and do not stop them. For it is to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. And he laid his hands on children and went on his way. Now, really, in today's world, it's hard to imagine how low in society children were. Men were really the only ones who had any societal value. Now, not only did Jesus value women, but Jesus made sure that children were in the equation as well. He is a wonderful example to people like me who have never had any biological children to be mindful that, yes, I am responsible to parent any little being. I am responsible to ensure that children have enough to eat and have a place to sleep and are kept safe. In October, our friends from Ascent 121 came here to visit the garden. And I don't know about you, but I had never heard the difficult stories of sex trafficking. I had never met the children who had been impacted by this horrible trade, which finds home in the city of Indianapolis. Friends, I have to believe that sex trafficking and harming our children still makes Jesus very, very angry. Not just angry, no, I believe mad as hell. And I believe we too need to join in and say we are not going to take it anymore. Again, Jesus says, you are the parent of my children. It's your job to love and to care for them. We haven't made it yet. I swear that we can if we all seek to move forth to make a difference in the life of every child and recognize that all children are our own. The third episode of anger, which we highlighted in the movie, before the movie clip, is what, as I said before, the temple tantrum. As Jesus drove out the money changers from the spaces normally dedicated to prayer. He turned over those tables, he turned over the ATMs, which in those days had doves and cattle and sheep in them. He cried out the words of Isaiah, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. See, at this point in Jesus' ministry, he's running out of time, and he notes that the disciples are just not getting it. As he made his way to the temple, it was clear not only were the disciples not getting it, but society as a whole was not getting it. Jesus was and is continuing to call us to transformation beyond consumerism. You know, oftentimes we let our physical needs be filled with consumerism, with looking good, with eating, with filling our lives with all kinds of things in such a way that there is no room for our spirit to be filled. In his book, The Heart of Christianity, Marcus Borg writes about the Christian life. He says it has to be two things. It has to be transformational and relational. According to Borg, there are really only two transformations, and they all have to be held equally. The first, of course, is finding a way for your life to be guided and filled with the Spirit. The only way that we can do that is to let God fill that space. So often we let other things fill that space. He says if we can find a way to be in that kind of deep relationship with God, then we cannot help for the other twin pillar, which is a more communal experience. A communal experience to make a difference in society, both socially and politically. In other words, if we're going to be effective change agents for a more compassionate and just world, we must be able to change our hearts and open our minds. We first need to work on this internal transformation through our own intentional path. We, like those in the temple, so often lose sight of that internal path, don't we? We let consumerism and consumption get in the way of that relationship that God wants to have with us. If we can get that in order, we cannot help but find a way to put the world in order as well. See, something else that makes Jesus absolutely livid is self-righteous people. No, not just self-righteous people. Self-righteous people who should know better. Pharisees, Sadducees, religious leaders. For those who hold positions of power are in heaven going to be held to a much higher standard. And we have a responsibility to be the voice of God. And when we are not, do you know what Jesus calls us? He calls us blind guides, hypocrites, fools, and children of the devil. He saw the judgment that these holy people had towards God's children, and it made him mad as hell. And I believe it still does. For those of you who are not aware, the Garden is a reconciling congregation. Now, what is a reconciling congregation? It is an organization that is dedicated to the inclusion of people of all sexual orientations and gender identities in both policy and practices of the United Methodist Church. The Garden is one of 761 United Methodist reconciling congregations. Isn't that amazing? One of 761. That's right. Well, let me tell you something else. One of 761, and there are 30,000 United Methodist congregations. See, we at the Garden have decided that we want to be with a network of people who say all God's children are welcome. All God's children are welcome. No, but none of us come to this place with more or less sin. We all come here seeking the love of God. Friends, this week in the city of Indianapolis, we as the Garden have an opportunity to truly act as a reconciling congregation and to bear some fruit and to get mad as hell and not take it anymore. In May of 2017, United Methodist pastor Reverend Meredith married his partner, David Meredith, married his partner of over 29 years. Soon thereafter, he was brought up on a formal complaint by some fellow United Methodists. That complaint has led to charges being brought up upon him, and now he has to go to a trial. It just so happens that that trial, or that hearing, will be in the city of Indianapolis on Friday of this week. As a reconciling ministry, the Garden affirms the inclusion, and I want to encourage you, inclusion of all people, and I want to encourage you to head downtown this week to support Reverend Meredith. On Thursday evening, March 8th, at Broadway United Methodist Time, there's going to be a time of fellowship and worship. As I noted, you can tear off your card and be part of that conversation this week. And then on Friday, we will gather before the hearing for a time of prayer. We will pray during the hearing, and we will be present for Reverend Meredith after the hearing. Elie Wiesel is a Holocaust survivor who lived his life calling the world to open our eyes and our hearts to the pain of indifference. As one of 761 out of 30,000 congregations, we cannot be indifferent on this topic, my friends. We must act. We must get angry. And we must seek that the love of God transforms this situation. Elie Wiesel said this: "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not hearsay, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference." I believe that God has given us a unique opportunity this week, my friends. If we are truly a progressive congregation who wishes for all to know the love of God, it's time to act. Amen.